Welcome to History 2323, lecture number 3, entitled The New South. Okay, in the transition from slavery to freedom, the Radical Republicans in Congress passed three amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And the South will proceed in the post-war period to undercut each of those amendments. So that's going to be the theme of this particular lecture. So the 13th Amendment is the end of slavery, freedom. So it made the Emancipation Proclamation permanent and nationwide and part of the Constitution. So most African Americans will decide initially, and you can see their options there, to work as wage labor on their old plantations. Number 1 and number 2, you really aren't options because you need cash for that, and then sharecropping was another one that you need to have something to contribute in order to have sharecropping work. So wage labor didn't last long, a couple seasons, and then you move to sharecropping, which would be the next option up. Land, capital, and the harvest. So the sharecroppers would generally provide the harvest and the care for raising the crops, but the land and the capital, the seed, the animals, so on, usually was provided by the landowner. So it worked fairly well at first, but eventually the farms began to shrink a bit, and that eventually, and also you had to grow cotton. That was the cash crop expected, or that was what the South wanted. That their economy was their number one moneymaker in their economy. So it became, especially if you had a bad year or if there was a drought or something of that sort, it began to become difficult to make it through the year on, especially bad years, on just living on growing cotton. And so this will require African Americans, farmers, to take on debt, and eventually this debt becomes massive, and so that will leave them tied to the land. They can't pay it off. So this is what I call a form of debtor peonage. So their freedom in the 13th Amendment is going to be undercut in many cases through the sharecropping experience. The 14th Amendment provided equality, equal treatment under the law for African Americans, and these were undercut by the Jim Crow laws, which began simple black code stuff in the South. Eventually, though, it became more systematic in how they implemented certain rules that African American communities had to abide by. So the purpose was to stigmatize African Americans as inferior and to ensure that economically they got jobs only at the bottom end of the economic ladder. And it began in the private arena. So you have private segregation in a private restaurant. You put up a sign saying no African Americans allowed. Eventually it will move to public, and then it will also move to, by custom, we've always done it this way, to by law. Okay, and that's where the Jim Crow laws come in. So there'll be a series of court cases, and the key one will be the Plessy case, which basically sets up that separate but equal doctrine. So you can separate the races in the South as long as they're equal. Okay, that's going to be the law of the land because that's a Supreme Court decision until we get to Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. So for the next 58 years, this will be it'll be a segregated society in the South. Many will get out, those who could. Some went to the Midwest to farm. They're called the exodusers. Others chose other avenues. But again, the Jim Crow laws are going to set up a society where equality, equal treatment of the law was not a reality. The 15th Amendment is the right to vote. So in the aftermath of the Civil War, African American men over 21 and older were voting in mass. Okay, so the South had to figure out a way to undercut that because remember, in a couple of states you actually have African American majorities in Mississippi and in South Carolina. So you'll have some disenfranchisement, which will be the stripping of the right to vote. And the way they will do it, and this is the part that you should focus on, are the taking advantage of African American illiteracy and poverty. Okay, so the way they took advantage of their illiteracy was through things just like voter registration. If multi-box law, if you didn't put the ballot in the right box, if you have separating the ballots, secret ballot, if you couldn't be able to read it, that would be another problem. And then just a literacy test. Now, you're going to see here, poor literate whites will get around these things. That will be the last point here. So poverty would be a poll tax is how they did that. And this was the most popular way of undercutting the black vote. You charge them to vote. So these two methods will undercut the African American vote severely in certain states, but almost everywhere in the South. I think all but one southern state used the poll tax, if not all of them. And remember, the poll tax isn't outlawed until you get to the 24th Amendment, which isn't until the 1960s. So the exemptions are there for poor whites. If they own property, they got exempted from all those other things that we just mentioned. Or if they understood the Constitution rather than having to read it. Or if they had good character. Those three were kind of standard to get them through so they could vote still. But these last two were ones where if they had fought in the Civil War on the Confederate side, or if their grandfather had voted, and now those two will be eventually ruled unconstitutional, but they were there for a little bit. So poor literate whites continue to vote en masse, whereas African American, the vote was whittled way down, in some cases 80 to 90% down, to undercut their vote. So this will be their lot in life until we get to the modern civil rights movement. This concludes Lecture 3.